Professor Goldin is the University Professor for Globalisation and Development. He's also the Director of the Oxford Martin School. And without saying anything further, I'd like to introduce him now.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming on what's turning out, I hope, to be a lovely spring, couple of minutes of sunshine. I wrote Divided Nations because of my concerns regarding our ability to manage the 21st century. And I'm in an extraordinarily fortunate position as the director of the Oxford Martin School in having well over 300 academics in Oxford as part of the school working on some of the key challenges of the century. And we are confident that the collective knowledge in the world and science will be able to address, together with, if there is political will, the key challenges. But if there's anything that keeps us awake at night, it's the concern of the disconnect between knowledge and action, between people's ability to understand something like climate change or pandemics or finance, and their ability to act on it. And as this puzzle has festered in my mind, I've come to wonder how it is that we can move this. And I've come to conclude that this really requires all of us as citizens to think more about this and more deeply about this, and to, in the end, be part of the solution, not the problem. And so that's why I wrote the book, and I hope you find it stimulating. It does not, I'm afraid, have all the answers, if only it did. What it poses is a set of puzzles and questions, and I hope pointers towards where the answers lie, and in some areas, some answers. I haven't been an academic for very long. I've just joined the university 6 years ago. And before that, I spent my career really in big institutions. I ran one. I was vice president of the World Bank. I was special representative at the United Nations. I was involved in the Uruguay round of trade negotiations with the WTO. So I do feel that I have some scars on my back, and that I have an insight into how these organizations and negotiations work that not all academics are able to have. And this has been an amazing experience. I've had the good fortune to work with wonderful people like Nelson Mandela in this, and many other inspiring leaders like Kofi Annan at the United Nations. And the UN Reform Task Force I was on had just an extraordinary group of people. But that report, like many of the other processes I was engaged in, have gone nowhere. And it's not through lack of good people. Great people who dedicate their lives to these institutions, care deeply about global governance. It's not that they're cynical, and it's not that they aren't smart, and it's not that they aren't committed. They're all of those things, but they're not successful. And in the end, they ground down into believing in marginal change as being what you fight for. So you care deeply whether Africa has a 2.1 or 2.2% shareholding at the IMF, or whether your trade tariff entering into the European Union is reduced from 5.7 to 5. That's what you negotiate around. These are important things, and they add up to major progress. And when you look at the sweep of history over the last 50 years or so, one can be very encouraged by many things that have happened. But I've concluded that they're not going to be sufficient to deal with the type of challenges that we now face as a planet. Recent negotiations have ended in gridlock. Climate change, nothing has happened on. Migration is an orphan issue where there's no global conversation of any note. Cyber is also an orphan issue. There's no global community on cyber. And pandemics, there is an institution of, the WHO, but after speaking to many, many people, I've concluded it's not fit for purpose. And of course finance, which is my comfort area, if one can call finance a comfort in any sense, has displayed itself as totally incapable of meeting 21st century challenges. So I've selected these 5 different areas as illustrative, certainly not exhaustive, of the sorts of issues that we need to be able to manage if we are to deal with 21st century challenges. There are clearly many, many others, and there are many things which have lingered from the past that we need to worry about. Nuclear proliferation, poverty, biodiversity. There are many issues I don't deal with in any depth in the book, and that's not because they're not important, they are. It's just that I feel if we can make progress with one issue, we would have learnt to cooperate. We would have learnt how to work as a planet rather than as divided nations. And when we learn that, we will learn how to solve other problems as well. So it's very important, I think, that we have some success in dealing with one problem, and I don't really mind which one it is, and learn to cooperate. The basic problem, as I see it, is that over the last 100 or so years, the world has become fragmented. My previous book, Exceptional People, which is there, is on migration. And I was quite amazed in working on that book to find that about 100 years ago people didn't have passports. The concept of nationality that we have now was a foreign one. And there's some great novels written about people encountering customs officers and things for the first time. But over this 100-year period, the world has fragmented, and more nations, so about 50 created in the last 50 years, not least in the breakup of the Soviet Union. And what looks like the tendency is that more and more will be created. We want to leave the European Union, Scotland wants to leave us, and this is happening everywhere, and I'll come back to why I think that's happening. But the tendency is centrifugal, spinning out, separation. People are seeking to establish their own identities. They are feeling that the global governance structures or their national governance structures, in the case of the UK, or in the case of the UK's relationship with the European Union, our regional governance structures are not fit for purpose. They can't understand how the things that affect their daily lives are being decided upon. And so they want to become more local. They want to fragment. And we see this around the world. People want to try and get control, understandably, of the forces that determine their future. The mistake they make, I believe, is feeling that somehow if your government is closer to you, you have more control over your future. The paradox of the 21st century is that everything is global. And everything that affects our future dramatically is likely to come from beyond our borders. And that is why it's really a fool's hope, I believe, to believe that if you somehow build a wall around yourselves and become small, you will be able to determine your future. You will have less control the less you are coordinating with others on your future. But that's the tension. It's a problem of attribution. It's a problem of people's sense of drift and of being buffeted by forces that come from abroad, whether it's a pandemic or a financial crisis or migrants that they believe take their jobs or cyber attacks. It comes from somewhere else. And so the response, I think rationally for many people, is to try and insulate themselves. So the risk we face is deglobalization. It's increasing xenophobia, nationalism, protectionism, as a response to a sense of inability to control one's future. That would be disastrous. It would lead to a downward spiral in which the great gains of the post-war period are lost. So the challenge is, how do we control our lives and yet coordinate? The context for all of this is the remarkable changes that have happened in the world over the last 50 years, and particularly the last 22 years or so. And I see the fall of the Berlin Wall as the defining moment. I'm from South Africa originally and left South Africa to come to live in the UK. I was in exile here and was fortunate enough to go back and work in the government of President Mandela, and believed at the time that the reason for that was due to the heroic struggles of South Africans and the lot of blood that was lost. And that was certainly true. But what I've come to realize subsequently was that was part of a much wider systemic change in the world. A change which has brought democracy to over 80 countries over the last 25 years. And that really was heralded by the end of the Cold War and the integration of Europe, but also other things that came along with that, like the opening up of China, the removal of capital controls, or the reduction in capital controls, progress on technologies, which brought the world together. So over this period, we've become virtually connected because of the growth of the internet, which of course didn't really exist prior to the 1990s as a global network. And we've also become physically more connected, and we're more proximate. There are 2 billion more people on the planet since 1990 than there are now. And we're mostly urbanized now. So we're densely packed, we connect. And we are in an increasingly hyper-connected, complex system. So everything that happens somewhere affects everywhere else in ways which were unimaginable before 1990. And this is the best news that's ever happened to humanity. It's the reason why this is the best time to be alive. It's the reason why the chances of escaping poverty are greater than ever in human history. It's the reason why we can be incredibly optimistic about the future. Because more genius is being unlocked in the world, and fragments of this are connecting and creating ideas which are just quite remarkable, and opportunities for individuals are greater than they've ever been. And that's because of this opening up, the coming down of walls, the opening up of societies and connecting of ideas. That's the upside. The downside is hyperconnectivity also leads to cascading risk and growing complexity. When you open your doors, wonderful things come through, sunlight and sunshine and ideas. But what also comes through is biopathogens, financial crises, and other things you don't like. So the great challenge is how do you have the one harvest the upside of it, that one of connection, and yet not the fragmented dissimy that could come from a very disunited and fragmented system. The only way that I see of managing this is through increased coordination, through an increased ability of us to realize that our futures are interdependent. And the paradox is that while everything has become more interdependent, and certainly everything we consume and everything we do and our futures are more determined than ever by things outside our borders, nations are operating in a totally unevolved way, as if the world was still like it was after the Second World War. Our politics, our international institutions are unchanged and unfit for 21st century purpose. The sorts of reform efforts to me are like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, fiddling little reforms, not the reforms that are required to meet the great challenges of our time. The question of whether these institutions can be reformed is obviously a key one, or whether we should create new institutions. My own view, having been part of many, many reform efforts, is that it will require much greater political will. In the end, one cannot blame the organizations for the failure of global governance, as many people do. Blame the IMF or blame the World Bank, blame the WTO, blame whoever, the United Nations. These institutions have their failings, and I certainly recommend in the book many radical changes in them, including a complete renewal of many of their staff and a much more rotating system of skilling within them, because many of them operate like old civil servants with people who have been there 20, 30, 40 years, who have no comprehension of the challenges of our time. But the real problem that these institutions face is a lack of political will. They can only be as good as the governments that own them and run them. And what you get in these institutions is blocking coalitions of governments that see no interest in reform for various reasons, either because they're threatened by the agendas, as for example the US is on the UNESCO agenda, or because they basically don't want to empower an institution which is above their power. So they actually don't want institutions more powerful than governments. So they keep them weak so that they can't tell them what to do. Of course, they don't mind them bullying other people around. Just don't bully them. And this, of course, is the classic tension between, for example, the US and the global institutions. They love them as long as the institutions obey their command, and then they don't like them anymore when they don't. When you have global rules, you really do need collective commitment to the obeying of those rules. Like a football game, you have a system where you're all meant to be knowing what the playing field is and playing to common objectives. And when the referee shows a yellow or red card, if you just say, I'm not going to get off, I'll carry on doing what I want, you cannot have a game any longer. And that's what happens in the global system. There was a fascinating insight prior to the financial crisis that came from a conversation I had with a former Treasury Secretary in the US, where he said he wasn't even aware when the IMF was doing a surveillance mission on the US. Now, in the rest of the world, even in the UK, literally the red carpet would be rolled out for the person. They would see the Treasury Secretary, diaries would be opened up to meet with this person, etc., etc. It's a very big event. Certainly the poorer the country, the bigger the event. And that's testimony to the power relationships that operate behind the scenes, but also the lack of caring. Basically, these institutions were for someone else, not for them. And so when the crisis erupted in the US was caught off guard, but so were the international institutions, because they really didn't have the data they should have, which is quite bizarre, seeing it's the most important economy in the world. So it's about power, it's about empowerment of these institutions. And of course, it's about change of these institutions. They have to be radically reformed. They have to have leaderships which represent their constituencies. The fact that the IMF is always a European, the head of the IMF is always European, the World Bank is always a US citizen, is just a complete nonsense and makes no sense in a globalized world. But these sorts of power trade-offs take all parties to be part of. It's no good the Europeans saying the World Bank has to give up a monopoly from the US when it refuses to give up the monopoly on the IMF, as it does. So there's a lot of hypocrisy in this as well, in the way the game is played. Part of what's happening in this, of course, and one of the reasons one can be optimistic, is the global evolution of economy and power. So by 2050, 80% of global economic activity will be in what we now call emerging markets. Already over half is. And China, Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa are, as the BRICS, becoming new power players, along with many others like Indonesia, Mexico, and others. But this power play has not yet led to a transfer of power. So you still have an increasingly feeble old G7 trying to dominate world politics and these institutions, but not having the resources or capabilities or bandwidth intellectually or in terms of their interests of really doing anything. And the new players are not yet ready. So when you speak to the Chinese or you speak to the Indians and the others about them, they've got lots of complaints about these global governance systems, but none of them are prepared to really play a leadership role. So this is a very dangerous time. It's a time of power vacuum, when the old leadership, whatever one thought about them, are no longer capable of leading, and the new leadership appear not to be ready. So one of the big questions is, how does one manage this period? And it's a particularly crucial period over the next 10, 15 years. It's a period I would characterize as the perfect storm. It's a storm with no captain that we're riding through. It's a storm on climate and the environment, because we're going to be peaking our carbon emissions over the next 15 years as China, India, and emerging markets come up, and the increase in carbon concentration, other greenhouse gases, maximizes in intensity. And if we don't do something over the next 15 years, we'll be way beyond many tipping points. So it's absolutely crucial on climate change. It's absolutely crucial, I believe, in other areas as well, and not least in finance. I spend a lot of time in the book going through these 5 areas that I've selected of Illustrative, showing why the pace of transformation is particularly acute at the moment, and why we're at crossroads in decision making. We're in crossroads on how the internet is going to evolve, and what sort of coordination mechanisms lie around it, and whether it's going to be overwhelmed by cyber fraud, spam, and other things, or whether we're going to have a global connected system. It's a crucial time. The recent discussions on that ended in deadlock, complete falling apart of all parties, no progress whatsoever. I've mentioned it's a crucial time in climate, and we know those negotiations are also gridlocked. It's a crucial time in finance, because although we know that the financial system is unfit for purpose, and the evidence abounds about us, there really hasn't been an ability to put something new in its place. There are organizations that have come up. There's lots of rules. There's a new Basel III, for example, on the capital adequacy in banks. But what's happening is happening at the national level. There's no global coordination capacity that's evolved. And the IMF hasn't renewed itself. It hasn't been empowered in any new way through this process. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence, I think, that the new rules are going to make possibly the problems much worse than better. You will get regulation of the wrong things, focus on the wrong things, some false complacencies, but are not addressing the fundamentals that are problematic in finance. So I'm pretty sure that there's going to be a cascading series of financial crises going through to the future until we're able to really coordinate and address that system as a systemic system. The big change that's happening on pandemics is that as we become hyper-connected, the potential for the spreading of pandemics, of course, increases in parallel to that. And we've done some great work in our emerging infections group in the Oxford Martin School, which exactly correlates the spread of the swine flu with airline traffic around the world into 130 countries within 80 days. But exact correlation, and we've also modeled the fact that anything that starts anywhere in the world can now be in the whole world within 2 days. And it's really the hubs, like Heathrow and others, that become the conveyors for this sort of systemic spreading. So the upside of our global connectivity also is the vehicle or the vector of the spreading of these things. And we know that with the internet and spam as well. So a lot to be said on finance, but I think the main thing to be said is that what's being talked about now is not going to resolve the problem. And there's some great papers coming out that, not least a new paper from the Executive Director for Financial Stability at the Bank of England, Andy Haldane, which has just shown that nothing that's being proposed now would have stopped the previous financial crisis. Part of what the financial crisis has revealed is a lack of comprehension of the way the world has evolved. Some of you may recall that Hank Paulson, who was the US Treasury Secretary at the time, had been the CEO of Goldman Sachs. And many of us had big reservations about the CEO of a major bank going to be the Treasury Secretary, because we thought there were lots of conflicts of interest involved with that sort of move. But we thought that there must be one silver lining, which would be that he would understand banking. And what was revealed, and he says this in his testimony to the Congressional Committee, trying to understand the financial crisis, basically, we did not know what was happening. We did not understand the system. Now, this is, I think, particularly worrying, because finance is the best governed of the global systems. It's the best understood in many ways. It's certainly got the best data, and it's got the best institutions, and it's the most joined up. So there's an international collective of people that run central banks that meet many times a year, and sometimes at long periods. They also all play golf together in Jackson Hole. It's a community, an intellectual elite with immense resources. Of course, they print the money, so they don't shortchange themselves. And when you ask graduates of great institutions like Oxford where they want to go, often the elite want to go to the IMF or these institutions. It's the elite civil service of the world. So if the elite civil service with the best data, resources, and great people were blind to the nature of the transformation of risk and collective action, what is happening in other sectors that are less well equipped, like health, for example, which has got a much poorer global coordination system than finance, and there are many others. So I think what this speaks to, and it's also discussed in Divided Nations, is this problem of complexity and rapid evolution that's been part of this recent period of evolution in the post-Berlin Wall falling period. The very, very rapid development of new technologies and the incapability of the elder generation to understand, in a sense, the nervous system that's operating here around the world, that's connecting everything and transmitting everything, as well as a failure to understand the evolution of complex systems. So we're putting a lot of effort in the Oxford Martin School into understanding complex systems, and I skim some of that cream of the ideas into the book to try and provide some perspective on where we're going. One of the things that comes out of this is that geography will matter more and more. And when we think about system stability, we need to think a lot about where things are and how they connect. And that's why you can protect the British banking industry all you want by making no one institution too big to fail, as my colleague John Vickers has recommended wisely. But if they're all co-located next to each other and the place has a pandemic attack or some other outage, it's not going to be much help that they're all separate institutions. So thinking about nodes and connectivity and system strength is very important, and that requires global coordination because, particularly for small countries like the UK, you will not be able to be stable on your own in that sort of networked system. So you need to think about how you connect to others and provide a structural system around that. So looking forward, the question is, where do the answers lie? Let me just briefly talk about two broad areas and then open it up for a discussion. I'm sure there's lots that you can help me with as we ponder this. The first is one of the strangest things about this period is that states, although they're multiplying and feeling as if they want to have more and more power and bring back power from places like Brussels or Washington or elsewhere, actually are becoming less and less relevant. And individuals are really the drivers of globalization more and more. And the power of individuals is growing in all areas. We know now that individuals can bring down the financial system, that they can create cyber attacks, etc. But we also know that, for example, in terms of companies' reputational risk, they can bring down great corporations. We also know irresponsible actions on the part of individual leaders of corporations, for example, now have systemic impacts that can no longer be hidden. It's an age of transparency and immense power to expose what individuals are doing. But one of the things that the new technologies are also allowing for the first time is that this is becoming the first time in history where a single individual or single small group of individuals can probably kill everyone in the world. This is new. This is very different to any previous period in history. And this is really through the rapidly declining price of sequencing, of DNA sequencing, and the ability to build Ebola, smallpox, measles for declining amounts of money. This raises immense new questions about governance and how you govern. It also, of course, on the side, raises big questions around privacy, surveillance, and many other things that will be coming down the road. So my nightmare scenario is a sort of wacko Texas Armageddonist community with biopathogens. It's not actually the Islamic fundamentalists, although I certainly worry about them, because I think they want to inherit the world and run it. I don't think they want to kill it. It's also, we worry about places like Iran and Israel and the tensions there, and Pakistan and India. but essentially no rational community in the world now, and certainly no state that's got half rationality, and maybe put North Korea as the only isolated place in the world in that respect, would create a world war. You would have to be collectively suicidal to do that. So I think that risk is low compared to the very rapidly rising risk of small groups. Now, this is a very big global coordination issue because it doesn't matter where these small groups are. You really want to be aware of them. So individuals, and this is only one dimension, are increasing their power, but they're also increasing their power to do good. And this is the amazing thing. And by connecting with others, they are able to transcend nations. And so the ability of people on any of these areas to form actions is very, very important. Some of you might have observed in the US recently that there was an attempt to control the internet and to put in new SOPA and PIPA, new intellectual property around some of the developments in the net. A community of about 80 million people arose spontaneously on the net and started protesting against this, and it was associated also with the blackout of Wikipedia and some other face pages. And within 6 hours, the US Senate dropped its legislation. So this is a new sort of mass contagion that comes out of individuals in a positive sense. It raises very big questions as well about the nature of democracy. You know, a process that had started through the legislature in the US, had gone through the normal democratic processes, was overturned in 6 hours. So it raises really big questions about mass herding of people, their ability to protest and to act, and their ability to change, which I think are a challenge to more conventional understandings of how legislative and other processes work. But it does point to the new potential of power that is arising on this. And there are many other examples one can cite on this. I'm also very keen in the book to try and understand the things that work and learn lessons from them. And many things work in global governance. You know, I fly around a lot, and I never worry about planes crashing into each other. I trust the International Air Traffic Control System, which has gone through enormous changes, just in the number of countries, the technologies, and many other things, but it works as a system. The postal union globally also works very well. Imagine the difference between post now and that of 100 years ago or even 50 years ago in the way it operates. It's evolved and it works. So why do these systems work and yet so many others don't? And what I think it's about is common standards where no one has an interest in adopting a different standard. You don't want to fly on the other side of the flight path. No one really has that interest, or you don't want to establish a postal system that's not going to be reciprocal. So you have a common interest, and why is it we can't have that same common interest in other areas? And what can professional networks that don't operate through states, transnational networks, and many of you might be part of such networks, professional bodies of lawyers or doctors or other practitioners, what can that teach us? And what can business teach us? While the global governance system has been fossilized in really a 50-year-old or 170-year-old structure, business, of course, hasn't. Businesses have no difficulty operating across 80 different countries and time zones and cultures in real time, adapting, managing, adapting to local norms and standards, but at the same time setting very common global standards, etc. So why can they do it and governments seem so totally incapable of using any 21st century ability to manage these problems? I don't believe in the end that we're going to be able to take away governments and somehow give climate change or financial management or anything to any of these alternative networks. Because in the end, these are about power relations that articulate national and people's interests. On the other hand, I think it's vital that we don't assume that the only way forward is institutions like the past, because we know they don't work. I'm actually not for the creation of new institutions. One of the things I think is right, but I've been trying to find this, so do tell me if you know the counterfactual. I don't think any institution's ever been closed down in the post-Second World War period, which is quite remarkable, given how different all the issues are. They get kept on drip feed by the governments where they're resident, because the international civil servants buy so many of the restaurant goods and services and things, keep the housing market afloat, or whatever other reason. But they're actually closed down. And so the old ones sort of morph with new mandates, but often not the capabilities. So the World Bank, for example, is probably the most active institution in the world now dealing with climate change and many, many other issues, although it has no capability really to do that, no mandate to do that. So I don't think that we should create new ones, and I also think we need radical changing of the existing ones. We need to ask ourselves, what can this institution do? But in the end, we need to say to our governments, we demand this of you. We know that our future depends on your ability to manage and coordinate. Retreat international. Don't say that local comes first, and that means it's at the cost of global, because that's to fail to understand what the 21st century is about. What the 21st century is about is that we start local, and in the end, of course, everything is local, and that's where our lives are, and that's what matters to us. But the idea that you can somehow do this disconnected from what happens nationally or globally is a very dangerous myth. It's one that we need to counter. So Divided Nations seeks to place the existing global governance structure in this context. I provide a series of recommendations as to what can be done at the local, national, and global level. And I hope in reading it, you find it stimulating as you go forward in this. Thank you very much.
We do have an opportunity now to ask questions. I should mention to you that this talk is being filmed and the questions are also being filmed. I think there are 2 roving microphones. I might be one of them. Please just indicate and I'll bring the microphone to you. Right.
The trouble is that democracy works in 5-year lumps, and what you're asking for is very much longer than 5 years.
Yeah, I think this is an absolutely vital point. And it's part of what this is about, is how one trade-offs the short term and the long term in politics. I think it's part of the answer, but let me just sort of touch on a couple of points which I think make it a little bit more complicated. First is, there's not much evidence that governments that aren't democratic are better at engaging in global institutions. So they can do many things locally which are long-term, and obviously China's brilliant at this. And there is some evidence that hierarchical societies, not only today but historically, are better at doing big, lumpy, long-term things, whether it's the pyramids or anything else. And that democracies find these investments very difficult, as we do with Heathrow, for example. So that's right. But it doesn't seem to translate into, therefore, non-democracies are better at joining global dots or understanding the long term. And one of the big discussions I'm having with the Chinese at the moment, I'm going back there in next week for this discussion, is the Chinese basically say, we worry, we've got 200 million people still in dire poverty, we've got our own priorities, it's very complicated managing 1.3 billion people and all of that. Yes, they're absolutely right. But what my argument is, actually, the biggest determinant of China's long-term future is not going to be Chinese internal management, because that is there. It's going to be what comes across their borders and how the rest of the world behaves. And unless countries like China play a much greater role in, say, climate change, financial global management, as they become more integrated with the world, that becomes more important. And it's not yet reflected in their participation in global institutions. So there's a catch-up there. So that's one point. It is true that democracies are bound by the short term because people that don't think about that lose their elections. But it's not true that therefore they are any worse at global governance. The second thing I'd say is that there's democracies who are very good at this and democracies that are very bad at it. We know, just comparing, say, the UK with France, or the UK with Scandinavia and others, that some democracies actually embed in themselves a very long-term and global view. The Japanese are extremely long-term thinkers, and the politicians won't get elected unless they talk about the long term and talk about their investments for the long term, both in terms of society and what the elderly will do, but also in terms of the investments, the infrastructure that are long-term investments. So there are democracies that can do that. We can get into a whole conversation about whether that's Asian exceptionalism or what it is. But there's also democracies in Europe that can do it, like the Scandinavians who can do it. Or the Dutch. I mean, they're very democratic, but they build their dikes, which are very long-term investments. So I think it's more complicated, and in the end, I think it's also about leadership. And we can have a whole conversation about, is the problem our leaders, and therefore is it our problem? We get the leaders we vote for. That's one thing democracy is meant to give you, is a say in who your leaders are. So if the problem is the leaders, the problem is ours.
Seems to be that when a serious crisis, such as the one unfolding in Syria now, comes up about, then that really is the test for global cooperation, which seems to be lacking, as apparently up to 1 million people are now displaced and are refugees, and yet we are told that the Russians, for example, and the Chinese seem not willing to cooperate with the Americans, the British and the French on the Security Council to tackle this very serious and tragic situation. So it seems to me that here is an example of where we desperately need some kind of international cooperation. I'm sure you would agree.
Absolutely, and indeed it's an example I cite in the book. And when I cited it, because the book I completed about 9 months ago, it wasn't even at the scale it is now, but it was already a travesty of human rights and our common humanity. As was Kosovo and as was Rwanda, and unfortunately we have a succession of these terrible examples, these tragedies that could have been avoided if there had been effective global governance. The UN Security Council is of course the institution which is responsible for all of this. And it, again, and it goes back to the title of my book, it's about divided nations. They cannot agree. And one of the arguments I make in the book strongly is that we, I wish the term was not so tainted, but we really need to move to, this is one of my proposals, is a situation of coalitions of the willing. Now, you know, I was not in support of the intervention in Iraq, and I think the term has been abused by what happened there. On the other hand, whether it's climate change, financial crisis management, migration, cyber, or human rights protection, using the gridlock in the global system as an excuse to do no action, I believe is wrong. And I believe societies that feel strongly about these things should form coalitions and act. And in the end, the moral authority and the success of their actions will lead to a widening of this circle and effective action at the global level. So I don't believe we will get decision-making of 200 countries or their designated representatives in something like the Security Council, which will deal with 21st century problems. But I believe that we will be able to get groups of countries together that start a process that others will join. Now, what's very important if you do these coalitions of the willing is to ensure that they're not just the bullies bullying others. So you need in these coalitions representatives of societies that are on central sides. On climate change, for example, I believe a credible coalition could be, for example, Europe with Bangladesh, Maldives, and a few other countries that would be dramatically affected. And I would be happy to sign up to anything they would agree.
questions to ask. You've gone on at great length about the fossilisation of the institutions that were created post-World War II. Many of those came into existence partly because we'd had the economic depression of the 30s, followed by the World War conflagration. Do you personally think that if we had a cataclysmic event of world proportions, goodness knows what that might be, that these supranational institutions might actually get their act together instead of being so complacent?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question as well. I mean, there are a number of things to be said. One is the institutions have been quite successful in managing what they were set up for. So we haven't had another world war. Poverty has reduced greatly. The world has become more integrated. And these are all partly attributable to those institutions that were established after the Second World War. So credit is due to them. The question is, are they still fit for purpose? Now, there are two sort of versions of how great institutions are formed. And one is that you can design them and put them in place, and the other is that they only happen like phoenix-like out of the ashes of a great fire. And that's the version of the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions. And it really did take a cataclysmic scenario to get those institutions established and effective. I think that might be true. In other words, you have to not only take people to the edge of the cliff, you have to push them over before they realize that what the consequences of continuing their actions are. It's a terrible indictment of our ability as a species to evolve, that we haven't been able to understand the future of our actions and act before it's too late. So it's only too late we act. Two reasons I don't like that argument, and that's why I'm trying to create a different way. The first is the human suffering involved is unacceptable. We can't say, all right, let's wait for a global cataclysmic event or climate change to be effective or global until we do something new. I don't like that. I just think it's unacceptable that we're smarter than that, that we're wiser than that we've evolved further than that. The second is actually doesn't even seem to be true. One of the greatest tragedies of the financial crisis is that it has not led to new financial institutions at the global level. It's a terrible sadness that the over 50 million people that have been made unemployed in the world aren't, as a silver lining, even getting the knowledge that it's led to political mobilization, consciousness raising, and a radical restructuring of the institutions, as happened after the world wars, for example. It hasn't done that. So how big does the crisis have to be to get a major structural change? And I don't think anyone could argue that this financial crisis was not big enough. So I worry not only about the argument, but about the transmission belt between crisis and change. And what I think where we want to be, I agree that it's unlikely you're going to get big change without crisis, but what we really want is a small crisis and a very amplified change. And part of that is societies being ready to do that when the time arises, and that's part of what this book's about.
Do you see some nations acting as honest brokers between the big power blocks? I mean, we're now talking about a network, so how does the network work? I mean, my personal experience is that Canada acts as quite a good broker between the US and Europe, and that Australia is seen as an honest broker by China in bridging to the United States, as two instances from my own experience, and you mentioned a few other countries as well. And if one's being positive about the future, is that one way you could move forward, and perhaps those countries should be seen as acting as that role?
I think that's right, and indeed there are some international negotiating bodies and organizations that always insist on a small country person being the head. The United Nations is one of them, which is why we have a Korean as the head of the United Nations now. We had a Ghanaian before that. That one of the superpowers shouldn't have the chief, and the idea is that they somehow will be more neutral and more able to talk to sides. I think there's some truth in that. Of course, it depends on the issue. Canada is not neutral on climate change. It's a big player that hasn't signed, was withdrawn from the Kyoto Protocol. And so I wouldn't see them as a neutral party on a climate change negotiation. But on something else, yes, I think that's right. So I think one does want to try and take out of leadership of organizations superpowers. And that's why one of the reasons it's absolutely wrong that the US and Europe have carved up the IMF and the World Bank. By the way, the WTO is another interesting organization. It's the only organization that actually has a highly contested leadership election. And I think what we're going to see coming out of this, Pascal Lamy standing down as the head of the WTO in July, I think we're going to see a very small power person running the WTO, which is very good.
I think we've got time for just one more question. Is there any?
I think it's 10 to 1. Can we go to 1?
Maybe 2 then.
Okay.
Hi, yeah, you mentioned about the coalition in the future. How do we avoid corruption and the issue of corruption that's happened in the last 50, 60 years?
Corruption sort of generically of people, or are you thinking in power politics?
In power politics, yeah.
Yeah. I think the sanitizing effect of sunlight is remarkable. And when you have transparency in the internet, of course you can also have a lot of distortion, and that happens too and is a big worry. I think it holds people accountable. And NGOs have been very strong on this. Organizations like the Transparency Organizations, Publish What You Pay, Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, these are great organizations. And increasingly, I think we are able to see what's happening. We're even beginning to see what the payments are from the big oil majors to, for example, the Angolan government, which has been hidden from view until recently. But it is a scourge, and it's a cancer that spreads. And when leaders are corrupt, then everyone under them is corrupt, because it's the signaling that comes from it, and the messaging and the tolerance is something which either is tolerated or not tolerated at the top. And that's why it's absolutely vital that the systems have leaders that aren't. Now, does that mean that democracies are better at stopping this than the other? One of the big worries, I think, needs to be the lobbying system in the US. This is in a way legalized bribery. This is a system by which, for example, the coal corporations or the rifle manufacturers or whatever are pouring billions and billions of dollars into congressional seats to get people elected. And when they're elected, they obviously feel some responsibility to the people that got them there. And they obviously want to get re-elected, and their parties want the money. And that's how the system works. It's not corruption, it's legal. But it's worrying, and it's worrying because the more unequal societies are, the more perverse this effect is. If you have societies where income is more or less evenly distributed, or not too unevenly distributed, then different parties have the ability to, if that system is legal, to pay for politics, if you want. Although I'm against, I'm against the whole system. Now, the more unequal societies are, the more that is captured by a small elite, which then reproduces the inequality, lowers taxes, lowers social welfare benefits, and all the other things through the lobbying efforts. And you can get into, and I believe the US is in this place, you get into a very dangerous spiral of capture of politics by money. But not everyone's money, the wealthies, the very wealthies, and very big corporations' money. This is very dangerous for democracies. And of course, just going back to the point I was making at the beginning, in the end, the international institutions are only what the national governments tell them to be. And when you have the biggest superpower in the world driven by interests which are heavily influenced by all these other considerations, that's worrying. And that's one of the reasons why the US can't sign up to the Kyoto Protocol, because the coal industry and the other lobby groups will not allow it to. So I believe one of the things we need to really worry about is money and politics and the connection between them. And the less that money influences politics, the happier I am.
I wondered if you felt that organisations like the EU, which only covers Europe, are beneficial to global governance, and if so, whether there should be similar organisations perhaps covering Central and South America, for instance, and possibly Africa.
I think the EU is the most remarkable experiment that really on governance that the 21st century has, 20th century saw. This was a very significant number of countries voluntarily agreeing to remove their borders and have free movement of people and many, many, many other things, economic and non-economic. And it's a complete reversal of the tide that I was of the picture I was painting, and a very, very important lesson as a result of how this works, which is one of the reasons I'm a great believer in the EU. The idea that people could move freely, this goes back to my book on exceptional people on migration between countries, was regarded as impossible. But we've shown in the EU it happens. And by the way, I haven't seen many unemployed Spanish or Greek people on the streets of Oxford, even though they have 50% youth unemployment rates, which is also a very interesting social experiment of what happens when you create these big open spaces and who moves and who doesn't move. So I think it's very important. I think the attempt to coordinate foreign Brussels is a great positive step, and I worry deeply about the UK in this and what it's doing with Europe. I think the EU has survived a terrible baptism of fire with the Euro crisis. It was sort of inevitable, given the economics of it, with an exchange rate that was too high for the southern countries, and the disparities between them and the levels of expenditure. In the end, I attribute it to a failure of governance. People signed the Maastricht Treaty, which set very strict guidelines as to their deficits and other economic criteria, and they all broke it. Knowingly, willingly, openly, and the countries that broke it first were the countries that advocated it, which is France and Germany. Okay, and the UK, by the way, also broke it. So, if you're going to sign global treaties, and they're literally tens of thousands of global treaties, then you need to believe in them, and you need to stick to them, and you need to be held accountable, and there needs to be executive authority over them. And what the EU has shown, as so many other treaties have shown, is that unless you have effective governance and empower the institution to manage it and give up sovereignty of your budget from the national on debt, on those crucial Maastricht criteria, from the national to Brussels, so that if you overstep the mark and go to foreign debt, someone can hold you accountable and do something about it, those institutions can't work. And what the EU is now trying to recover is something it agreed a very long time ago, which is you can't have your budget deficits widening when you're in a common economic area. That's not new. It just was never enforced. So I think it teaches a lot of lessons, and I think it is very encouraging. Of course, it hasn't stopped tragedies happening on its doorstep, Kosovo, Syria, etc. So whether we have an open, cosmopolitan, multilateral EU, or whether we have an EU behind increasingly defensive barriers, believing it can look after itself, I think is the big battle that's being waged in the EU. And I'm obviously for the cosmopolitan one, but it's a very important point.
Well, I think we've now come to the witching hour. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to join me in thanking Professor Goldin for an absolutely brilliant insight to an extremely complex and challenging area for all of us. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks to you too.